Yep, you read the title correctly. We're going to be talking about this today. Because recently I've seen people come to me and say, well, now I dropped the rare on this tank, that tank, and so on and so forth. And in this video, this isn't going to be so much of a, oh, you should never drop the rammer on anything and stuff like that. This is going to be looking at it from both sides of the argument, but then also then putting my reasoning behind why it won't make sense on certain tanks. Because there is a time and a place to drop the rammer, but most of the time you probably shouldn't. We're also going to be diving into vents as well during this, because that is mainly what people are dropping their rammer for, and how vents really doesn't give that much of a benefit, and it's mostly placebo in certain areas. As always, this is just my opinion on it, and I will be trying to take into account both arguments from both sides, but at the end of the day, this will be my opinion on the rammer and when it should be dropped, when it shouldn't be dropped. Anything other than the raw stats that you see is just opinions from both sides of the argument. The main argument against having a rammer and why people drop the rammer is that my tank, I never fire on reload, or I want to make sure the accuracy is as good as possible, and therefore I'll drop the rammer for something else. They are the main two arguments that I see regarding dropping the rammer. And to be honest with you, the first one, I can understand their reasoning behind it, because if you're not going to be firing on reload, then yes, this actually makes perfect sense. If you don't fire on reload, what's the point of having a rammer? Because that extra 2 seconds that a rammer would give you is kind of useless if you're not even firing. However, this is where people misunderstand about firing on reload. It is not needed to be firing on reload 24/7. If you are in a game and you are firing on reload even for 4 shots or 2 shots, a rammer has helped you out more than it hasn't helped you out. And most of the time, when you're in a brawling heavy, you are going to be firing on reload. It doesn't matter what your reload time is, you'll be firing on reload because you'll be brawling. An enemy is always going to be there, and you're always going to be in a position, at least you should be. If not, then that's just bad positioning and not the fault of the rammer, more of the fault of your positioning in the game. But if you are in that brawling environment, then always you will have a shot at an enemy, which then, in my opinion, means that there is no reload time that is too great. In fact, the higher the reload, the more you should be firing on reload, if we think about it. Because then that gives you time to back off, hide, get ready for the next shot, because you'll be reloading. And as you come out, you'll be reloaded, you shoot, you rinse and repeat. You're firing on reload every time. And then on the opposite scale, you would then maybe run into situations where you're not going to be firing reload, and a rammer might not help you because of the fact that you go and hide in between shots. Remember, if you're firing on someone else's reload, not yours, usually the lower reload is worse off. Let's start out by showing you the K91, because this is a pretty good model to show you how everything works. And it's also a very good model to show both sides of the argument. By default, this tank has 5.47 second reload, which is very, very fast. It has 320 alpha, and it has a nearly 11 second rate of fire. If we were to then go ahead and just add a normal rammer, not in the correct slot or anything like that, we can't actually put it in the correct slot for this vehicle, we then get 3.9k DPM, up from the 3.5, which is a 400 DPM increase, which is a full shot of damage and a bit. And then you go down to 4.92 seconds reload. If you were to look at this right now, you would say, yes, I'm choosing a rammer. Because even though that it's half a second, it's still probably worthwhile choosing, because of the fact that even if I'm not going to be firing on reload all the time, the difference there, even if I fire for, say, 30 seconds on reload, or even 10 seconds on reload, say I do just 2 shots in a row, that's still going to give me more DPM than I would have already had, and I can probably get into cover then as well. However, I want to then go ahead and add vents to the tank, and we're even going to go ahead and put it in the correct slot, because you probably will with this vehicle. You'll see that it adds nothing, right? This is nothing being added here. But that's because that's not how vents works. Vents doesn't work well on its own. Vents doesn't work well at all on its own, actually. If it has nothing to go off, it's a social animal, vents is. It needs friends around it. If it doesn't have friends, it's very sad, as you can see, with very pathetic increases just all round. Like 0.32 down to 0.31. What is that? I don't know. Terrain resistances, it makes no difference. Doesn't even help out the stationary camo because it doesn't have a camo crew. So it can't increase that. But what happens when we add on other things to the tanks? Because if this was the case, 100% nobody would use vents instead of a rammer, but people do at the moment. Let's try and understand why. So for our next test, we're then going to add in just brothers in arms with food. They're the only two things we're going to add. As you can see, the DPM again has gone up, reload time been reduced. Nothing else about the vehicle has changed because it's only a rammer. We go ahead, we add brothers in arms, we add in food, we click save. Our DPM has now shot up and reload time has really gone down just from adding those two things. Now, not everybody likes using food, and if you don't, then it's probably not worth using vents, to be honest with you. You should probably just choose something else. But if you were to use food, and I'm going to continue using food as this example, that difference, even I would be questioning in it. Because the DPM difference, past like 4,000, I genuinely, I wouldn't even notice. This has so much DPM that you are killing something in less than a minute, regardless of what it is. And the chance of you firing for a full minute are very low. And now, yes, I'm aware what I've said, you don't need to be firing for a full minute. But the difference in the reload here is negligible. So I can fully understand why people would not bother using a rammer on something like a K91 because it just doesn't really seem worth it. If you're not going to be firing on reload all the time, or say the majority of the time, then yeah, probably don't use it. Now, the difference between vents in the correct slot and bounty vents is not that different, because as you can see, we have 6% here, and then if we go ahead and use bounty vents, that goes up to 7.5%, so we gain 1.5%, which, as you can see, doesn't really make too much of a difference. Overall, if we look at it, not really. Bounty vents, if you don't have have room to put vents in the correct slot, then 100% bounty vents. But if you could put bounty vents, or could put normal vents in the correct slot, then it's probably better to just do that. Because, as we can see, the difference between standard vents in the correct slot and bounty vents, not really much difference. But let's go ahead and then say, okay, let's put rammer, bounty rammer on this tank. Now, the difference there is more, yes. But again, for certain people, they probably wouldn't notice the difference. If you're not going to be firing on reload, this is just irrelevant. It's a lot less negligible. That's a full, extra 0.1 of a second difference. Are you going to notice that in game? Probably not. And then just for fun, we had bond vents, which again doesn't really make too much of a difference. And if we were to use bond rammer, you go down to 4.43. Honestly, for this style of tank, even I would be torn of not using rammer on it. But that was a K91. What if we used something that would be brawling? What if it was a 907? Because with the K91, you can be a sniper, you can play it a little bit more passively. 907, high requirements, you want to be brawling, doing as much damage as you can, firing on reload pretty much all the time. At least that's the optimal situation for it. If we add a rammer with the brothers in arms and food all the way down to 5.2, which is optimal for this vehicle. If we were to then go ahead and say, okay, well, I'm going to change this now. We're going to put vents in here instead. We'll keep the rest of it, so brothers in arms and also the food. We now have 5.69 second reload. Now, some people may look at this and say, yeah, there's no point. There is 100% a point to having a rammer on a 907. Because for this vehicle, you want to be firing on reload. If you're not firing on reload, you're not in position. And the positioning is 100% the biggest key factor to water tanks, over literally anything else. Once you know the maps and you know the positions and you work those positions, you can do so much damage to the enemy team, and you should be firing on reload. The 907 in particular can side-scrape, can be annoying, and just be a little kind of like a rat that just doesn't die and just keeps nibbling at you. So 100% you want that 5.2 second reload. I would say the same goes for the 140, but to be honest with you, the 140 is a little bit less of a brawler than a 907, so that may be more up for debate. I don't know. But the biggest takeaway that I found when I've been looking at this, and this has been quite eye-opening for me, is that the lower the reload time, the more questionable it is to have a rammer, because it doesn't really provide you with that much benefit. And vents, in conjunction with everything else, remember, it's a social animal, right? The vents is. If it's combined with all of its friends, it's actually quite nice. Whereas the rammer is just a flat DPM increase, and on these super low reload time tanks, I don't really think that it's always the correct answer. Now, we're going to step it up to the IS-7, which is a big step in the reload department. This then goes up to 13.14 seconds. Now, if we were to go ahead and add in just a rammer that reload time goes down to 11.82. Now that's a substantial difference. That's a very, very big increase. And for a tank like the IS-7, it's actually very, very important that you have that reload time. Because I would say if you're anything past, say, like 8 seconds reload, maybe 7 seconds reload, that then gives you enough time to then peek back, reload, peek out, shoot, do that peekaboo kind of movement, side scraping if you can. But anything past, say, like 7 or 8 seconds, you should be firing on reload if you're in a brawling tank. If you're not in a brawling tank, then it's a completely different story, and I'll move on to that later on. But this 11 seconds reload is 100% you should be firing on reload every single time. That gives you more than enough time to position yourself ready for the next shot after you've just fired your last one. But again, adding into the equation vents doesn't really make any difference. But again, we need to have all of its friends with us. That looks a lot more enticing. However, we have not added its friends to rammer, so we now need to do that. And again, we're now nearly a full second faster at firing than the other tank. Now, will you notice a second? Lots of you will say no. However, as I've just said, this is a brawling heavy tank. You should have already figured out where you're going next, who your next target is, and as you're reloading, you find an angle to shoot them. Firing on reload is the biggest thing you can do in this type of tank. And it's just almost imperative that you do fire and reload because that is how you're going to get the most out of this tank. So anything you can do to boost up the DPM is important with the IS-7. Now you may say, well, I like to use off-road driving and then I put vents on it so then it boosts the off-road driving. That's a very valid point. But let's go ahead and take a look at the graph. Both of these tanks are IS-7s. One has vents, and they both have off-road driving and brothers in arms, as you can see here. If we were to go ahead and look at the speed across all terrain types, after 35 seconds, you have gained basically 1 km/h difference between having vents and not having vents. I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem worth it to me. And that's on hard terrain. On medium, the same thing kind of applies. In fact, exactly the same thing applies. It is a km/h difference. And on soft, exactly the same again. So saying that you're going to use vents to boost up off-road driving, yes, it does affect off-road driving. You are correct, but not in as much of a difference as you may think. If we were to go ahead and put this as bond vents, then the difference is a little bit more, but still not massively more. As you can see, we have now, what, a 1.5 km/h difference? Something like that. You see my point about this? Like, the difference is very, very minuscule. Now, if you were to use vents in conjunction with a turbo, and then let's say that we just had a normal bond turbo, but just a bond turbo on one tank, and then you had vents on the other tank, then the difference, again, is, no different, really. You just go faster, but the difference is still roughly the same. So, it doesn't really make sense, is what I'm saying. To choose vents if you want to go faster. Yes, it does make you go faster. I'm not denying that. But the difference, I don't think you'll notice. So I've set up these two IS-7s with how I would set them up. We have HP Turbo Rammer for one, and then we have HP Turbo Vents for the other. They both just have brothers in arms because that's the only thing that's actually going to affect the DPM. Or at least regarding vents, it would help out more. So that is there on both of these tanks. And you'll see the difference is quite big. 10.76 seconds reload versus 11.92. That is quite a big difference for these tanks. And considering that they don't really go much faster than each other either, regarding the terrain distances, as we've already mentioned, regarding this graph, I definitely know which one I'd rather have. And I know that some of you will be looking at this and saying, well, vents helps out more than just DPM. Choose the other perks and you'll see a massive difference. The difference isn't that massive. As long as you have the perks selected, that is the main thing that's going to boost it. Vents will only boost it by a little bit. It's not like it's going to boost it by a massive amount. Any tank that is going to be brawling and you will be firing on reload, you choose a rammer. And that basically goes for any heavy tank, as long as it brawls. There are some heavy tanks which are questionable brawlers, and then maybe that's something a bit different. But then again, that also then depends on what the reload time is. This also goes for anything higher than this. Again, if it's a brawling tank, Jagdpan Z100. Nobody should be dropping the rammer on a Jagdpan Z100. If you're not firing on reload with a Jagdpan Z100, I really don't know what you're doing. Because you should be brawling and firing on reload every single time. And lowering that reload is the best way of getting more damage. And with more damage comes more wins. Now, there are tanks in the game which I think have high reloads that you should probably drop the rammer on. Or at least Not outright drop the rammer, but consider it, depending on what your playstyle is. The FV 4005 is already a given. Lots of people drop the rammer. This is probably the first tank that kind of started to drop the rammer because it has a long reload time, the gun is horribly inaccurate, and you need to hit every single shot. So I can understand dropping the rammer on an FV 4005, and I think the majority of people can as well. But what about tanks like a Grille 15? Should you drop the rammer on this? You're not always going to be firing on reload. Most of the time, you're going to be at the back of the map, waiting for a target. You shoot every so often. You don't always fire on reload. Well, to this tank, it heavily depends, because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for this. Certain people will play the tank differently. If they want to drop the rammer because they are going to be playing right at the back of the map, and then never fire on reload, then 100% drop the rammer, do something else. You can't put vents on it, but you could maybe drop it for something else. Like, let's say, for example, you could go for something like this type of build, where you have low noise exhaust because the Grille's camo rating is god-awful, and you have a experimental turbo, which, again, doesn't actually increase the gun handling, it just negates the loss from the turbo, and they have IAU. But then it does bring up the question of, why would I use this when it doesn't really make too much of a difference? Like, if we're looking at this base stats values, you go from having a 7% camo rating to a 14% camo rating, you're still going to get spotted. The Grille's camo is awful. And even if you were to go ahead, paint the vehicle, put food on it, put camo on it as well, you still only have 26% camo. So it's probably not worth using low noise exhaust, which doesn't leave you with a lot of options. If you could put vents on it, then they'll be so much better, but you can't. So what do you choose? IRM to increase the traverse speed? Again, this doesn't actually increase the gun handling unless you're moving extremely slow. And even then, there's a cutoff point where it starts to then go faster because you've reached the maximum traverse speed. But that's way too much detail. You probably just choose a rammer, don't you? So then, yeah, you just choose this? You see what I mean? It's very weird. It doesn't matter with this tank, because I don't really think no matter what you put on this tank, it's not going to improve the situation you can get yourself into. But either way, hopefully this was eye-opening, maybe. Hopefully this helped you out with understanding why people are dropping the rammer, and also my opinions on it, and why you probably shouldn't drop the rammer on the vast majority of tanks. But then for some vehicles, yeah, I can understand why. So yeah, this is an open discussion in the comments. Let me know your thoughts, and keep it civil, I guess. But yeah, there's no real right or wrong answer here because it's just an opinion at the end of the day. But there are certain tanks that definitely make sense or make more sense to drop the rammer or keep the rammer than others.